So now we're going to continue on here, and we are going to start talking about the kind of institutional differences in democratic states. And because your book only talks about a couple of key points here, I'll also keep my comments limited so we can move along in this discussion. So we're going to go through, just as you've probably been introduced to it before, three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial branches. We'll start with the executives and executive branch. The focus here, I think it's worth us understanding the distinction between head of state and head of government. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to do it by starting out by using the United States. In the United States, what we do is we bring these two things together: the head of state and the head of government. When you think of the head of state, think of the person who symbolizes the country, the person who represents that country in, say, for instance, international affairs, in terms of the outward image and appearance of the country. And as we will come to find out, most of the world, or most of the democracies, hold this out as a ceremonial position, the head of state. But the head of government is very different. So while both President Trump plays the ceremonial role as the figure of this country, he also plays the role of the head of government, which means that he is responsible for basically controlling and managing the federal bureaucracy, the implementation of laws, the bureaucratic aspect of our country. Now, I think we can contrast this with the United Kingdom. The United States was an outgrowth of the United Kingdom, but we don't do everything the same. The countries share very different cultures, and consequently, in the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister is the head of government, that being Theresa May. And Theresa May's responsibility is essentially that she's elected, or she is elected by the parliament. She comes out of the parliament itself, basically as the majority group in the parliament, the party with the most representation she comes from, which is the Conservative Party, and she doesn't play the role of the head of state. In fact, that role is played by Queen Elizabeth. And I think you can find the difference here. The United States doesn't have a tradition of monarchy. And since we didn't have a tradition of monarchy, when the United States designed the presidency, they designed it with these two functions being together. But as the development of the United Kingdom has taken place, they have both held on to their monarchy, and the monarchy does some important symbolic things like knighting people and doing ceremonies and whatnot. But they have separated the Queen's power or the King's power from the person who's responsible, again, for running the government, and that being the Prime Minister. Many of your European countries who had monarchies still have this division. Many of your countries that developed presidential systems have what we have, which is the amalgam of those two positions in one. When we move on to talking about the legislative branch of government, we're going to talk a little bit more in an upcoming lecture about the distinction between parliamentary systems and presidential systems. But for our purposes here, we can point out the distinction between a unicameral system and a bicameral system. Again, many of you, I think, are probably familiar that in the United States, we have a bicameral system. We have a Senate as an upper chamber, and we have a House of Representatives as a lower chamber. Many small countries don't require the same bicameral system, and our bicameral system in the United States was a consequence of a great compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. But many small countries have unicameral systems. Just simply means that they have one chamber instead of two chambers for their decision making. Bigger countries tend to have bicameral systems. Bicameral systems are more common in the world today. Historically speaking, it's worth noting that bicameral systems were designed to control democracy because there was an idea that you had to have an elite upper house, right? So in Great Britain and England, the the upper chamber is called the House of Lords, and it's that way for a reason. And the Senate was designed in a very similar way to be kind of just a safety valve, if you will, for the more democratic House of Representatives. And that's traditionally been how the division has played out in those bicameral systems. Finally, we can talk about judiciaries. One important distinction between different types of judiciaries out there is that, in the United States, we look to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is both the court of last resort, it's the final appeals court, and it's also our constitutional court. Those two things go together in our system, but they don't in all other systems. Many systems divide out these two, so you'd have a constitutional court that would interpret the Constitution and talk about and determine legislation, whether it's in conjunction with the Constitution or not. And then they would separate that out from their appeals system, and they're a high appeals court. But again, in the United States, we bring those two things together. The one big thing that's worth also talking about is judicial review. Again, many of you will be familiar with judicial review. It's the power that the court has to determine whether a legislation or act of the head of government is in good faith with the Constitution, is consistent with it. And here it's worth us pointing out the distinction between what we can call concrete review and abstract review. Again, in the United States, we use concrete review. What you need in order for the Supreme Court to review the constitutionality of a given law or act of the president is to have a lawsuit, is to actually have a case. And then what the judges do is they start with a case, and then they determine the constitutionality from that case basis. Not all high courts, not all constitutional courts in democratic systems work that way. Some can use what are known as abstract review, which is, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, we're building out this really key legislation, something like, if you think about Obamacare. And the question is going to be, is the Supreme Court, is the High Court going to determine that this is constitutional or not? Well, in our system, we have to wait until a case comes before the court. But in other systems where you have abstract review, you can actually have a legislator or somebody in government actually have the constitutional court review the legislation to determine its constitutionality before it ever gets voted on as a legislation. So there's a little bit of a distinction there. Judicial review, one other interesting thing about it is that we think of it as this, every democracy has judicial review. That's certainly true today. Most democratic countries have judicial review, but it wasn't until the 1950s that scale started to shift towards more judicial review. And in this final point that I'll make then is that the more active judicial review position in democratic societies has correlated with the growth of our liberal democratic rights. The more rights people have, the more constitutional interpretations and the more specifically judicial review has been used for those ends. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. We'll move on to talking about presidential and parliamentary systems in the next lecture. Thanks.